For today is from the book of Jeremiah, the first chapter, verses 1 to 10. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Ah, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am only a child. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a child. You must go to everyone I send you to, and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth, and said to me, Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thank you, Norbert, for reading from Jeremiah. As we begin our fall series proper now that we're sort of settled into post-summer. So each fall, we tend to take a run at some place in the Old Testament. And I've been particularly curious about parts of the Old Testament that don't get a lot of attention. So you remember a few years back, we did the book of Judges, which was a revelation to me. I now love that book. I didn't. But Jeremiah 2 is one of those places where I think we tend to maybe not quite know how to read. So there's a story told of Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, who he was reading the Gospels, and when he got the parts he didn't like, he cut them out. Like with a little razor. And so this is the Thomas Jefferson Bible. Apparently you can still see it at the Smithsonian. And they're just pieces he didn't like, he cut out and he threw away. And so, and he had, okay, that's not a good idea. Let's just put that out there. But he's not alone. So in the book of Jeremiah, later on in the book of Jeremiah, there's one of the kings who calls for the scroll of Jeremiah's prophecies. And as they're read, he literally cuts them up and throws them into the fire. You can read that in Jeremiah 36. He just sits there and he just kind of cuts a piece of the scroll out and throws it in the fire to warm himself or maybe to barbecue. Who knows? But he's just burning Jeremiah's words. So again, not a great idea and not something that we probably would do literally. But I do think perhaps figuratively we read the Bible this way. We pick and choose the parts we like, the parts we understand, our favorite parts. And there's whole parts of the Bible we kind of don't read. And Jeremiah might fall into that latter category, and I get that. Jeremiah is hard to read. So you could read in the New Testament, for example, Paul instructs Timothy to pray for world leaders, for the government. And it's pretty clear. You're like, oh yeah, I should pray. It's not that hard to understand what Paul was saying then and what Paul might be saying now. Compare that with Jeremiah in chapter 46, where he rails against Egypt for all the things they've done, and he casts, he's got all these sort of judgments against the nation of Egypt, and you're like, how am I supposed to hear that? Do I? And how do I apply it? Am I supposed to rail against Egypt? What do you do with that text? And it's just a little bit more complicated. So this morning I'd like to give you a little bit of an on-ramp to Jeremiah. given that I think it's just, it's a trickier text to get at. And part of the difficulty, I think, is our understanding of prophecy. Prophecy is one of those words that gets used slightly differently in the Bible than it gets used in our culture. So if you think of prophecy in our culture, if you were to go ask people, hey, what's a prophet? Or what's prophecy? They would say something like this. A prophet is one who foretells future events. This is right from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. One who foretells future events, a predictor. So you could think of the weather person being a prophet, but they're not very good at that. But you could think of a guy like this, the street corner, like the end is near, and he's kind of predicting sort of doom and gloom. And synonyms in the dictionary: diviner, forecaster, somebody who kind of has some special ability to peer into future times and then tell us in the present times what's going to happen. Okay, that's kind of, I think, generally speaking, cultural understanding of prophet. What prophets do, they foretell the future. Now, prophets in the Bible do some of that, okay? But it's limited. That's not their primary function. They do say some things. They say, judgment's coming, and they point to some future events. Probably worth noting that almost all of the future events the biblical prophets are imagining have already happened. They were immediate future events. Judgment is coming on Israel, and then that happened. Judgment is coming on Judah, and that's what Jeremiah is going to be concerned about. And that too has happened within the biblical story. So even though they predict some things, not their main function, it's still quite limited, and most of what they predict has actually already happened for us. It's still the past. Okay? I think a more helpful understanding of a biblical prophet would be this, also from the dictionary. A person regarded as an inspired teacher or proclaimer of the will of God. And the example the dictionary gives is, lo and behold, the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. It's a person regarded as an inspired teacher or proclaimer of the will of God. This was the very thing that Norbert read, the call of Jeremiah. I mean, listen again to how Jeremiah is called. The word of the Lord came to me, to Jeremiah, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart, and I've appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And then I'll drop a few verses to verse 9. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth, and he said to me, I have put my words into your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot, to tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. So Jeremiah is called to be a spokesperson for God, a proclaimer of what God is, God's desires, God's longings. And you're going to see this in spades in the book of Jeremiah as we sort of unpack some of this. Now, their primary function, then, is not to predict, as God's spokesperson, is not to predict future events. Their primary function in the biblical story is to call people back to the covenant. Now, the covenant's a biblical word. Let me just give you a very brief definition of that. So, a covenant is a framework. It's a way of imagining a relationship. It's a framework for that relationship. This is how this relationship's going to work. You create a covenant. Probably the closest we might have in our culture still is marriage. Marriage is a covenant. And it's like you enter into a marriage and say, this is kind of how the relationship's going to work. And this is how if we kind of move outside of this framework, the marriage won't work. And so God calls his people into relationship. God is a relational being and desires and has created humanity for relationship. And so God creates these covenants with his people throughout the biblical story. In particular, the covenant we're interested in is the one where God calls his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of oppression, out of a way of seeing the world, that is, there's winners and losers and the downtrodden, and there's like power, and power is corrupt, and all of that of like the Egyptian empire. God calls them out of that, and they enter into a covenant relationship with God, into this relational framework. Now, the vast majority of this is God's doing, okay? But God desires relationship, and with humans, with real people. And so there's a part that actually depends on us as well. Depends might not be the best word, but there's a part that we're invited to contribute. He wants a real relationship, not just like I don't have a relationship with a machine. Certainly not the same way I have a relationship with Sherilyn, right? Like people, like it's a real relationship. I want Sherilyn to respond. I want her to contribute. It's not a mechanical sort of thing. So God sets up these frameworks for a relationship where God does the biggest parts, plays the biggest parts, but we're invited to participate in meaningful ways. God wants us to. Now, if you read the biblical narrative, particularly books like 1st and 2nd Kings, more on that in a moment, you'll see that the people of Israel constantly abandoned the covenant. They didn't want to participate, not the way that God told them to. They weren't sure they could trust God. They didn't think God was good. They didn't like what he was asking them to do. They liked the other gods of the other nations better. And again, they turn away from the relational framework. They say, well, no, we don't want to operate within this framework. We want to operate over here, do our own thing. And so time and time again, because God longs for relationship, he sends prophets into the story to the people of God. And those prophets, their function is to say, hey, don't do that. Come back to God. And they use highly evocative language and image, and they do some crazy things, but it sort of reveals God's deep longing for relationship. Don't break this framework and live over here. There's going to be negative consequences if you do that. Please, come back here to the covenant. So the function of the prophet isn't so much to foretell future events. It's to call people back to God. Okay, now if you really, truly hear only that this morning, and you now want to switch off because you had a late night, I'm okay. That's so key that you understand that point. That the primary function of biblical prophets is they're calling people back into this covenant relationship with the living God. Okay? Really, truly get that. It'll really help you as you read these prophets. Okay? There's other things they're doing, but that's their primary function. Calling people back to relationship. All right, so some of you can check out. You're good. You think about other things. I'm fine. I'm not offended. But if you want to just stick with me for maybe 10 more minutes, I'm going to give you a little bit of on-ramp to Jeremiah proper, okay? So that's prophets in general. What I've just said is true of like Hosea as well, or Isaiah, the other prophets. We're going to zero in now on Jeremiah. And Jeremiah can be, like the prophets, can be a little bit obtuse. It's a little bit sort of opaque, hard to kind of what's going on here. So let me give you 3 keys to reading the prophet Jeremiah. Actually, all the prophets. These things will be helpful as you engage the text. Pay attention to history. Prophets always show up in a particular time. What is that time? What's going on? They're speaking to particular situations. And it would be helpful if you understand what that situation is. So why is Jeremiah in chapter 46 railing against Egypt? What's that about? Well, if you know a little bit about the history and what's all been going on, that comes into a little bit sharper focus. Okay, so history. Just know a little bit about the when of the prophet. When were they around? When did they speak? Okay? The second thing I would invite you to consider is the audience. Who? That's the who question. Who are they speaking to? Are they speaking to this nation or that nation? Or who is their primary audience? Who are they addressing? And the last thing that would be helpful as a key is to think, how do they then address them? So when are they speaking? who are they speaking to, and how do they go about it? And Jeremiah in particular, a number of the prophets do this. Jeremiah in particular is going to use poetic form. And we'll talk a little bit about that. This morning, I only want to talk about history and audience. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about form and poetry. And you're going to go, you've got to be kidding me. No, actually, it's amazing. And there's reasons why God uses poetic form through the prophet Jeremiah. And things really start coming to life. I have been, and more about this next week, but I've been blessed to know Cliff as a poet, and he's slowly been chipping away at my I don't like poetry kind of stance, and I'm beginning to actually listen and like poetry, and things just anyway, I'm getting into next week's sermon, so stop. That's next week. This week, let me just tell you a tiny bit about history, the history of Jeremiah, and a tiny bit about who Jeremiah is addressing. Okay, that's all we're going to cover. Are you with me? Stay with me. Okay, here's a comic that Sherilyn came across in her class. She's taken a class at Regent this semester, and this is a comic. It's hard for you to read, so I'm going to read it for you. I'm Jeremiah, also known as the Weeping Prophet. Kind of a bummer of a nickname, I know. I got my nickname because of the job given to me by God to reveal the coming siege and capture of Jerusalem because of the idolatry and sin of the people of Judah. For this, I was opposed by false prophets, reviled, beaten, and imprisoned. Third frame. The false prophets appeased the people by telling them that the kingdom would be restored in 2 years. But I told them the truth. They would die in captivity. But God did promise to restore our nation, and his promises are true. Through me, God gave them a future hope. For I know the plans I have for you, God promised them through me. Plans for your welfare and not for evil. But it wasn't what they wanted to hear. They didn't want to believe that. Or they didn't want to believe that God would allow them to be captives for 70 years. And I haven't even told you the worst part yet. I've seen how my words will be used 2,600 years from now in high school graduation cards. I know. I thought it was funny. But Jeremiah is not speaking to high school graduation when he's speaking those words. They're just kind of like, we apply them like he's talking to like captives who are going, like being like forced out of Jerusalem into Babylon. And they're weeping and wailing and they're thinking God's abandoned them. It's a complete, like the context. Anyway. Whatever. Bible commentary humor is pretty narrow, I guess. So, listen, it's helpful. All I'm trying to get at is helpful to understand some context. Okay? And it's not as hard as you think. I am also privileged to know someone like Mark Connor, who's a historian, and I've sat with him and probed him about history and how we read history, and it's wonderful. But you don't actually need a PhD to understand Jeremiah and the historical context. Here, I can do no better than recommend to you the Bible Project and their little short intro videos on the books of the Bible. Like, look at those. Look at the one for Jeremiah. They'll give you a little bit of a window into the world on what's going on for Jeremiah, and they'll outline the book. Super helpful. It'll take you like 7.5 minutes. We've also on Sermons Plus put an entry from a Bible dictionary. You can find these online. If you literally Google Bible dictionary, you'll get some. And in a Bible dictionary, look up Jeremiah or the book of Jeremiah maybe. And you'll just get a little bit of a teaser. It'll just give you won't know everything about everything, but you'll know a little bit about the context. But here, look, Jeremiah actually gives you some. The words of Jeremiah's son, Norbert, you read this so well. I won't read this as well as you. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth, in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him, to Jeremiah, in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah. Now, there's a lot of ayahs in there. Josiah, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah. You can read about all of these kings in the book of 2 Kings. So the Bible itself will give you some context for this. If you were to read 2 Kings chapter 22 through 25, 4 chapters, 22, 23, 24, 25, 4 chapters, you'll get a sense of the time period in which Jeremiah is working and living. Okay, so the Bible itself can give you some context. So here you've got these kings. He names Josiah, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. There's 2 kings in between that. Each of them only reigned for like a very short time. This is a highly, highly volatile period of history for Israel, or the nation of Judah at the time. So Israel had split into 2, and this is just the southern. Anyway, but these are the kings. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. He was really young, and he in his time period, he operates or sort of institutes a whole set of religious reforms. He sort of rediscovers some things and calls the nation back to God. He's generally considered a good king. And Jeremiah's call shows up, like that's where God calls Jeremiah into service during that time. Josiah's reign gives way to Jehoahaz, who I believe gets assassinated or at least gets deposed. Jehoiakim gets put in, and he's the guy that burns the scroll, right? He's reading Jeremiah's words and throws it into the fire. That's that king, and then that gives way to a guy called Jehoiachin, who is in power when Babylon rolls in and attacks Jerusalem. And he doesn't last long. Zedekiah gets put in, and he's the king that eventually is on the throne of Judah when Babylon fully conquers Jerusalem in 586. Okay, that's all kind of within 2 Kings 22, 23, 24, 25. You'll get an overview of that. But like a short intro video, a short reading in a Bible encyclopedia will get you a long ways to understanding what's going on. As I said, religious reforms happen under Josiah, but you can see that this is also a time of political upheaval. It's also actually a time of economic and social upheaval. There's incredible shifts in population happening here. National boundaries are being redrawn. There's going to be shifts of balance of power in the international scene. So this is now the Assyrian Empire is in its waning days, and there's a new power coming, and it's called the Babylonians. Like that's happening, and Israel feels caught between these 2 powers, these 2 superpowers. I mean, if you didn't know I was talking about Jeremiah, you might think I was talking about today. Right? A time of unprecedented political, economic, social upheaval. National boundaries are being redrawn, shifts of population, empires rising and falling. It sounds a bit contemporary to me. But I don't want to map Jeremiah one for one onto, there's some unique things happening then and unique things happening now. But just understand that the world was chaotic. And Israel, the people of God, the people of the Israelites, they were trying to figure out how to exist within that world. And unfortunately, as the story plays out, they turn from God. They turn from this relational framework, this covenant. They kind of give up on their allegiance of God. They say that feels too fragile. And they turn to the gods of other nations. They seem more attractive, maybe more powerful, more glamorous, a little bit more promise over here than staying with God. And so rather than remaining faithful to the covenant or remaining faithful to God, Israel chose the gods of other nations. And it led to a shocking mistreatment of people. And Jeremiah is going to challenge this, and particularly the vulnerable in their society. And what I just want you to be aware of, because Jeremiah is going to address it, is the link between worship and justice. It turns out who you worship will affect who you love or how you love. And Jeremiah, as God's spokesperson, is deeply concerned. So if you worship money, it will shape how you treat people. But if you worship a God of compassion and love and kindness, it will also shape how you treat people. And these are some of the things that come into focus for Jeremiah as God's spokesperson. Just know that he's operating in this very complicated time. And he's calling people to be faithful to God in that complicated time. And that to me feels like a very contemporary message for us. How do we be God's people in this time? As we pay attention to that in Jeremiah's time. Okay, so that's just a little bit of history. Obviously, there's lots I haven't said. You could spend weeks and weeks exploring the history of this time. It's fascinating, and we just put on some resources on Sermons Plus, which is a tab on our website. They'll give you like sort of little windows in to help you understand, because if even by understanding a little bit of the history, you'll understand a lot more of Jeremiah. It won't be quite so opaque. Okay, so much for history. History lesson over. Sorry, Mark. Let me move from history to audience for a moment and imagine who is it that Jeremiah is actually addressing here. In the midst of all of this chaos, who's he speaking to? And I tend to think prophets are, they're a bit prickly in their tone at times, and I tend to think they're a little easier for me to read when I imagine them speaking to somebody other than me. Right? It's like, oh, they're speaking to those people. Not necessarily you, but like those people, whoever those people are. And for sure, prophets do some of that. They do address some of the nations around Israel. And Jeremiah will do that. But remember, and this is back to the very first point I made, and the most important point. Remember their primary function. The primary function of a biblical prophet is to call the people of God back to God. So that means almost by association then, their primary audience is the people of God. In this case, it was the Israelites, the people of Judah, who were trying to figure out how do we live in between these superpowers, and they're frenetic. They just don't know what to do, so they make alliances with Egypt, and then they make alliances with this person and that person, and they're just scrambling to remain secure. And they're looking everywhere but God. And Jeremiah, as the spokesperson of God, steps into the story. And we've subtitled this, this series, Lament and Longing in the book of Jeremiah. What you're going to hear is, like Jeremiah is sometimes referred to as the weeping prophet. You're going to hear Jeremiah just weep. Like, why are you doing this? Don't do this. This is only going to lead to destruction. And he's going to express this longing, but remember that he's speaking for God. God is weeping. God is longing for his people to remain true to the covenant structure, the framework. Don't chase these other gods. There's no security there. It will go sideways. In Jeremiah's day, it did go sideways. But this is, I think, if I'm honest, what makes reading the prophets hardest for me. Like the history, it can be a little bit hard to get at, but it's not that hard. I just got to do a little extra reading or talk to somebody who's a little smarter than me. And those people are out there, and those books are out there, those resources are out there. And they're accessible to you. You don't have to be, a theology student at a graduate level to understand. They really are accessible resources. But this now, just recognizing that Jeremiah is speaking to the people of God, and in the larger history, that includes me. That's a little harder, right? Because now I need to be a recipient of what Jeremiah is saying. Now he's not just talking to people out there vaguely, but he might be talking to me specifically, or to us. And all of the frenetic activity and the idolatry and the things that the people of Judah experienced, maybe that's not beyond me. Maybe I get caught in those same pulls and tugs and streams, and I just get decentered. And so one of the challenges I think for us to read is to allow God's word to speak to God's people still. And rather than cast myself as the prophet speaking to people out there, maybe I need to just cast myself as I'm actually the recipient of these words. How do I hear them? Some months ago, I can't even remember the sermon, but Caleb talked about the understanding of the word understand. To understand, it'll be up here in a moment. Could it be to stand under? That's a good definition of the word understand. Understand isn't just about some kind of like intellectual, like I get what this word means and this word means and that word means. It includes that, but to really understand is to stand under the text, to let it speak to you. And as Jeremiah raises concerns about unfaithfulness and idolatry and making alliances with this political entity or that political entity, I need to ask myself today, am I caught in the same streams? Is Jeremiah actually speaking to me and asking me to come back to covenant faithfulness? And that's harder, actually, to approach the text with humility and recognize that maybe these are words for us. So that's as far as I'll go with the introduction, the on-ramp today. We've talked very briefly about history, very briefly about audience. Next week we'll dive into form, and I promise you we'll get more into the text. I'm excited about what Jeremiah has to say. But let me transition us for a moment here from what Jeremiah is saying to this meal, communion. As I said, the primary function of a biblical prophet is to call people back to covenant, back to the covenant, this relational framework of being in relationship with God. And this meal is that. What Jeremiah does in words and what I've done this morning in words, this meal does with your body. It invites you to embody covenant faithfulness. Listen to Jesus' words in Mark chapter 14, when I get there. So this is Mark's telling of the Last Supper. Get the verses here. And while they were eating, to Jesus and his closest friends at the time, Jesus took a bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." And so what Jesus is inviting his friends into is a renewed covenant. And so this is how we participate this morning. And the very thing that Jeremiah is going to be inviting the people of God to be doing throughout the book of Jeremiah. Remember the covenant. Remember the God who stands at the center of that covenant. Now we practice, at Varsity Bible Church, we practice open communion and understand that Jesus invites all of us to the table. And it speaks to the radical invitation and welcome of who God is. But there's another aspect to communion that sometimes we don't emphasize as much, and that's also, this is a chance to renew your commitment. Renew your covenant. In theology, they talk about renewing your baptism vow. Like when you got baptized, when you gave your life to Jesus, you made a commitment. And communion then becomes a way to honor that commitment and to recommit to it. So you are both welcome, truly, at the table. I believe that about God. God invites us. It's a wide open invitation. But there's also this other aspect at the same time where God is inviting us to renew our commitment. Listen to what Gordon Smith, who used to be in Calgary, writes about this. He used to be over at Ambrose. 2 sentences from him. Each time we come to the table, we establish our identity as the people of God. People who are alien to this world and its values. We come for a realignment of our lives with our confession of faith. So we've sang this morning about a God of wonders and a God on whose life we build. And the practice of the communion this morning is for your body to be that confession. That you're going to come forward and partake in this covenantal meal and to renew our allegiance to Jesus and not to the values that are swirling around in our world. In the same way that Jeremiah is going to call people back to God and not just to the values that is swirling around in his time. So you're invited, friends, to this meal to remember and to experience the unconditional love of God. Truly, come. But you're also invited this morning to align yourself anew with Jesus and his kingdom, to surrender, to lay your life down, your values, your allegiances, and say, Jesus, I'm yours. Let me link it very quickly to the book of Jeremiah. And then I'll invite the band up after this. Jeremiah, this is well into his book. He's wept a lot by this point. And then he says this, the days are coming, and these are God's words through Jeremiah, but the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. It won't be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them out by the hand out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This covenant I will make with the people of Israel, the people of God. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law into their minds. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because we will already know the Lord. From the least of them to the greatest.